Hello and welcome, I'm Joshua Barnes and you're watching NewsX World. Let's first take a look at our top stories. The Kremlin says that Russia is continuing to work with the US after Donald Trump said he was furious with Vladimir Putin over delays in a ceasefire deal with Ukraine. Meanwhile, Trump says Ukraine will never be a part of NATO. Iran's supreme leader says the US will face a sharp response if it follows through on Trump's bombing threats over a nuclear deal. Indirect communications have not yet led to a deal with sanctions from the US in place, while Iran allegedly increases their nuclear capabilities. Deadly Israeli strikes have continued on Eid, with emergency workers among the bodies recovered. Meanwhile, Israel has issued a counter-proposal to the Egypt peace plan in Gaza, which Hamas has agreed to. The death toll in Myanmar has now risen to over 2,000, according to the ruling military junta. Rescue efforts are continuing as foreign aid and emergency workforce contributions continue following the devastating 7.7 magnitude earthquake on Friday. Rescue officials have pulled another body from the collapsed skyscraper in Bangkok, Thailand. 75 people are still missing inside the building that was under construction before it collapsed during the earthquake. French far-right leader Marine Le Pen has been barred from public office for 5 years. It comes shortly after she was convicted of embezzlement, ruling her out of the 2027 presidential race, barring appeals. US President Donald Trump signals a new tariff plan will apply to everyone as stock markets slide as the 2nd of April implementation date draws closer. World leaders have reacted ahead of a potential trade war. South Korean star Kim Soo-hyun has given a tearful public address denying allegations made by the family of actress Kim Se-ron. They say the 37-year-old dated the actress when she was 15. Kim Se-ron died in an apparent suicide in February. We start with the Russia-Ukraine war, and Donald Trump has said Russian President Vladimir Putin is already aware of the US president's anger towards him. Trump has also added that tariffs on Russian oil would come within a month without a ceasefire deal as a measure that could dent Moscow's most crucial source of income for the war. Vladimir Putin keeps pushing the war with Trump now on field. His forces have carried on bombarding Ukraine both on the front and deep into Ukrainian heartlands. He has barely budged in peace negotiations, frightening an agreement on an unconditional 30-day ceasefire with a load of conditions. The US leader warned Volodymyr Zelensky he could face big problems if he tried to back out of a potential minerals deal with the US. The Kremlin has responded to President Donald Trump's remarks about being very angry with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said that we continue to work with the American side, first of all, on building our bilateral relations, which suffered enormously during the previous administration. The United States has also accused Zelensky of trying to pull out of an agreement which would see the US gain access to Ukraine's natural mineral deposits after the Ukrainian leader said he would not agree if threatened Ukraine's potential EU membership. Well, joining us to discuss all of these latest developments is Martin Saires, a foreign affairs analyst who's joining us from Frankfurt. Martin, thank you very much for being here today. I want to first look at the comments that we got overnight from Donald Trump, clearly very frustrated with Russia and the speed in which this ceasefire is going. Do you think that he is losing patience with Vladimir Putin?
Well, his reaction suggests growing frustration, particularly over Putin's reaction to replace Zelensky with the UN-backed government. However, I think Trump has historically expressed willingness to negotiate with Putin, so this could be also a strategic move to appear that while keeping channels open, in my opinion.
Absolutely. And looking further now at the responses that we've had from Russia, they say that they're continuing to work with the US administration and with Donald Trump's administration. How do you think this response will sit with Trump and also other world leaders? Because Trump clearly saying that he's frustrated, but Russia's seemingly brushing it under the carpet.
So I actually think this suggests that Moscow is still interested in maintaining dialogue with the US. We need to remember Dmitry Peskov, the spokesman of Kremlin, has said that they are willing to negotiate with Trump. So I think Russia is not in a position that they're willing to escalate with the US. I think they are going to try to negotiate. And I also think Trump is trying to, he has been criticized a lot because of his approach to Russia. He's trying to fix this criticism and to be more skeptical towards Russia and be more neutral. But again, I think I don't think this is going to escalate. I think Trump and Putin will go into terms.
Yes, and looking at those discussions, which of course are ongoing, every side wants something out of this. We know that Russia are very clear. They don't want Ukraine to join NATO. They don't want to give up the territory that they have gained. Donald Trump, of course, is looking to get this deal done, potentially looking at minerals deals. For Zelensky, he's really looking at a sort of post-war and looking potentially at troops, European peacekeeping troops being in Ukraine, but also that issue on NATO, something Trump today has shut the door on. How pivotal do you think this is, given the US influence, not just among NATO nations, but also across the world?
So I think the move, like Trump is very skeptical towards NATO and the US military commitments abroad. I think Trump has said it clear. He will never accept Ukraine into NATO because it can be dangerous and this can lead to a third world war, actually. But at the same time, I think Trump is being neutral right now. He doesn't support Ukraine being a member of NATO, but at the same time, he will never accept changing the president. Like he has said that he's completely against the Russian intervention and Russia asking for changing Zelensky, that he will never be backing that. So I think Trump is trying to be neutral and trying to be good with both parts, even though it's almost impossible. But yeah, I think right now, I don't think there will be an escalation. I think Russia has expressed willingness to cooperate with the US, and we will see in the next weeks if there's a possibility of a deal.
Yes, absolutely, Martin. To bring an end to our discussion, of course, communications have been had between the United States, Ukraine and Russia separately. How do you think these three parties in these negotiations move forward when such discussions have been had, but clearly we're at a point where nothing has fully yet materialised as planned?
So I think each party needs to give up something. I think we're seeing two leaders that they are completely trying to get their full interest. Zelensky initially didn't want to accept any deal that involves giving up land, giving up NATO, because he's actually eager to be part of NATO. But he's understanding that this administration with Trump on front is not going to be willing to be, in a certain way, biased against one of the parties. Even though the Western world has been very critical about Trump and they see Trump being biased and in favor of Russia, which I don't think is the case because Trump will never be 100% in favor of Russian interest. However, he wants to avoid an escalation, and I think also Russia is not willing to escalate in this situation. The spokesman has been expressing this. They are willing to cooperate, and I think each party they need to give up on something.
Yes, absolutely, Martin. We are running out of time, but very quickly, of course, you are based in Frankfurt. What role does the European Union and the EU nations have in these negotiations?
So, in general, the European Union is biased towards Ukraine, and they see negatively any kind of approach towards Russia. They are completely in favor of supporting Ukraine 100% and Ukraine's interests. But we see right now an increased support for other type of right-wing governments. And these kind of governments, they're very skeptical towards the European Union. So I think in this case, we're seeing a shift of policies. And I think in a near future, the European Union will understand they need to get in terms with Russia. They need to face it, and they need to negotiate it.
Absolutely, Martin. Thank you ever so much for joining us and providing your insight. The impasse in the Russia-Ukraine war and continued negotiations is something we will follow closely here on NewsX World. But we move on, and tensions between the United States and Iran have escalated sharply. This comes after President Donald Trump threatened unprecedented bombing if Tehran refuses a new nuclear deal. In response, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, warned of a strong blow if the US takes action. Iranian state media reports that the country has readied missiles capable of striking US positions across the world. Meanwhile, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian rejected direct talks but left room for indirect negotiations through Oman. As the standoff intensifies, both sides brace for a potential showdown. Washington has also hinted at reintroducing secondary tariffs, further pressuring Tehran. Analysts warn that miscalculations could trigger a wider conflict in the region. With indirect negotiations still on the table, the coming weeks will be critical in determining whether diplomacy or confrontation prevails. Well, joining us to discuss these developments is Daniel Roth, the researcher, director of the United Against Nuclear Iran, joining us from New York. Daniel, thank you very much, firstly, for joining us. To provide our audience some context, why is it so crucial that a nuclear deal is agreed with Iran?
Sorry, your guest. Could your guest just mute himself? Thank you, Mr. Hyde. Why is a nuclear deal so crucial with Iran? Well, because the Islamic Republic of Iran, by its very nature, is a revanchist radical regime that wishes to export its definition of radical Islam, not just around the region, but across the world. And that Iran with a nuclear weapon would have an umbrella that would be very difficult to penetrate. It would threaten US allies throughout that region, and indeed, you can imagine it on some vessel threatening the United States. We saw Iran last year carry nuclear-capable missiles on its vessels, in the Western Hemisphere for the first time, and around Indonesia, around the South Pacific as well. So, ultimately, as President Trump has said, and as was echoed by his predecessor and his predecessor before that, it is absolutely unacceptable that Iran gets a nuclear weapon.
Yes, Daniel, before we move on to the comments that were made by both Trump and Iran's supreme leader, I have a question for you relating to the previous deal that was done. Of course, in 2015, a deal of leading nations was agreed with Iran, but in 2018, the US was withdrawn from that, and that has seen an increase potentially in Iranian nuclear capabilities and planned capabilities. Is this Donald Trump trying to rectify a mistake he made in his own first term?
I think let's just go back to that deal. There's quite a few misconceptions about what it actually entailed. So let's say the propaganda around that deal was that it prevented Iran getting a nuclear weapon. It did no such thing. It simply delayed Iran's ability to acquire the materials to get a nuclear weapon for a certain period, so for a period of 10, 15 years. Once that period was lifted, which is 10 years after, it was 2015, as you rightly said, it's now 2025, Iran would be legally allowed to get materials for nuclear capabilities, nuclear weapons capabilities. So that's the first thing. In terms of Trump rectifying his mistakes, I agreed with his decision to withdraw from the nuclear deal. The US tried accommodation under President Obama. It did not work. That resulted in this JCPOA nuclear deal. It then tried appeasement under President Biden, or really ignoring Iran and its nefarious behavior. I think it's time now to try again assertiveness. There was a period of 2 years from 2018 to 2020 where, maximum pressure, this idea that full sanctions would be imposed and enforced. That resulted in Iran's, foreign exchange coming down to the low hundreds of millions from, peaks of tens of billions. Unfortunately, Trump was not able to continue his policy. Obviously, he was elected out, but he's now got 4 years to continue that policy. And I think this is the way to go.
Yes, Daniel, looking forward now and looking at potential escalation that could have ramifications across the Middle East and elsewhere. Trump putting it plainly that he would strike Iran if a deal wasn't agreed upon. Do you think he would actually follow through with that, given some previous comments made by Trump that haven't always come to fruition?
I think the president, like Americans at large, is instinctively, he's an isolationist. He doesn't want, US ground troops. He doesn't want America to be involved in every single conflict around the world. And as I say, I think that is a sentiment that's shared by Americans. So it's significant that he is making these very tough warnings against the regime in Tehran. I think he just understands the nature of it, as I was talking about it in my first response. He understands that the Islamic Republic of Iran is not going to back down. They're not simply going to, agree to a deal and then change their behavior. He understands that that pressure has to be applied seriously. So yes, he's making this threat, and like many regimes, or most of the regimes in that particular part of the world, they only respond to strength. They don't respond to appeasement. They don't respond to accommodation. So we'll see. As you mentioned, the Prime Minister President Pezeshkian has said, nothing's going to happen. Iran will strike back. Well, we saw Iran strike back on Israel last year, sent hundreds of ballistic missiles into Israel back in April and then in October. The end result really was no major damage. So that was just against Israel. America, the world's most effective fighting machine. I don't think it's really going to affect the United States military and their expectations and their plans when it comes to the Islamic Republic.
Yes, absolutely. Daniel, to bring an end to our discussion, you mentioned Israel there, and of course Iran and their backed groups across the Middle East have been fighting with Israel. Does a war or does a conflict between the US and Iran pose risk to those fractious fight zones that we're seeing already in the Middle East?
Well, Israel's been at war with Hamas since October the 8th, 2023. It's also been at war really with, as you say, Iran's proxy partners and terrorist groups, including Hezbollah, the Houthis, which have caused huge damage to the world economy through, increased commercial costs, shutting down the Red Sea transit zone, for example. So the US now is trying to take care of the Houthis, focusing on them, letting Israel deal with Hamas, who continue to not release the hostages, and they could end that particular war within an hour should they choose to do so. I think President Trump understands that really the fractiousness, to use your phrase, stems from that central Tehran regime. They really are the octopus behind all these terrorist tentacles. And if anything is really going to happen long term, then the Islamic Republic is the main focus, and that needs to be dealt with.
Daniel Roth, thank you very much for joining us and providing that insight. We do move on, but we stay in the Middle East. Israel has rejected Hamas's acceptance of an Egyptian brokered ceasefire proposal, instead submitting a counter-proposal with new conditions. Hamas leader Khalil al-Hayya confirmed that the group had engaged positively with the Egyptian proposal, which also called for an increase in humanitarian aid to Gaza. Here is what he said.
وقد تسلمنا قبل يومين مقترحا من الإخوة الوسطاء في مصر وقطر، تعاملنا معه بإيجابية ووافقنا عليه، ونأمل ألا يعطله الاحتلال أو أن يجهض جهده.
However, Israel has insisted that any ceasefire must include the release of at least 11 living hostages and half of the deceased hostages in exchange for a 40-day truce. Israel's counter-proposal also demands that Hamas leadership commit to disarmament before any military withdrawal is discussed. Meanwhile, the original plan, mediated by Egypt and Qatar, aimed to secure a phased ceasefire, the release of 5 hostages per week and an eventual Israeli military withdrawal from the international guarantees. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has defended Israel's stance, arguing that continued military pressure on Hamas has forced the group to negotiate. Meanwhile, international leaders are weighing in. The European Union has urged both sides to prioritise diplomacy, while Hamas has accused Israel of deliberately prolonging hostilities to weaken the group further. The humanitarian situation in Gaza remains dire. Over 50,000 Palestinians have been killed and more than 114,000 have been injured, according to Gaza's health authorities. The United Nations and humanitarian groups have called for immediate action to allow critical aid into the enclave. As negotiations continue, the world watches closely to see if a breakthrough can be reached or if hostilities will escalate further. Well, joining us to discuss all of these latest updates is Ali M. Bushback, an independent Palestinian researcher who is joining us from Cairo. Ali, thank you very much for joining us on this programme. Once again, we ended there with the humanitarian situation, and I'd like to start with that. We know the death toll, according to Gaza-run health ministry officials, has now topped 50,000. Given your expertise, what is the current situation on the ground that you're hearing?
Well, thank you for having me. The situation is miserable in Gaza Strip and in this enclave, especially after the Israeli strict blockade on Gaza in the beginning of March and stopped that cutting off the humanitarian aid to enter Gaza. That's make the situation more than miserable and beyond imagination. While during the holidays for Muslim that marks Eid al-Fitr, and today is the second day for Eid in Gaza, while Israeli bomb is still rain down over the Palestinian civilians, and there is no safe place in Gaza. People are frustrated of such a situation, and as I mentioned yesterday, Palestinian civilian, they are taking to street to protesting against Hamas and criticizing Hamas behavior since the resume of the war. They are frustrated without any hope. Now today also Israel demand or order the Palestinian who's in southern part of Gaza, Rafah, to evacuated that city, which more than 90% of the city they have to leave and they have to displace from Rafah area. We are again we are witnessing again the displacement and the evacuation during the most holidays, despite the American envoy Witkoff proposed a proposal for Hamas to extend the first phase of the negotiation and first phase of ceasefire until the Eid and until the holidays of Jewish Passover, but Hamas unfortunately rejected the proposal and delaying their response. They, make the Palestinians' life more trouble, and there is a flu. There is a shortage in drinkable water. There is a shortage of grocery. There is a shortage of flour, especially in northern Gaza, and the price of the supplies is increased incredibly, while the Palestinian and the ordinary people can't manage his everyday food and livelihood. That's make it the situation is behind the imagination and make it more than miserable for the civilians. Hamas, the day before yesterday, excluded more than 6 Palestinian activists, claiming that they are coordinating with Israel. Also, the situation in Gaza internally boiling against Hamas. People are criticizing Hamas on social media, and we have witnessed a lot of
Yes,
social
Ali,
media
sorry to interrupt you there. I do want to pick up on that because we know the situation in Gaza has, of course, been worsening, and there have been protests against Hamas. Benjamin Netanyahu and his government, the Israeli government, have now put the ball back in Hamas's court. They're asking for hostages back, which is something that if the phase 2 of the ceasefire deal had happened, then that would have been the case and we would have seen all hostages returned. So at this point, is it really that Hamas are the outlier in this situation in wanting a ceasefire? Because it seems from the surface that if they do release these hostages, then the fighting will stop. And that will lead to the stopping of such devastation and such humanitarian crises affecting millions across Gaza.
Says the day before yesterday, Khalil al-Hayya, one of the senior leader of Hamas, he announced that Hamas accepted the Egypt proposal releasing 5 Israeli, including the American route Israeli captive, for extended ceasefire for 60 days. But today also Benjamin Netanyahu, the office, they said there is a 4. They changed the things. They said it must be Hamas releasing 12 captive, must be alive, and to extend the first phase of the negotiation. There is a 4 challenging. Facing the solution of the ceasefire in Gaza. First of all, Hamas demanding for a security guarantee that written about not resuming the war during the negotiation or during releasing the 12 hostages. 12 hostages. Benjamin Netanyahu, he asked for half of the alive hostages with Hamas. And also there is one significant challenging facing that the negotiation. To extend the first phase, Hamas stressed about moving to second phase of negotiation, which Benjamin Netanyahu is not accepting. Benjamin Netanyahu want to extend the first phase of negotiation, and after that, Hamas releasing all the hostages, the future is unclear for the Palestinian and for the ceasefire and long-term truce between Gaza and Israel, as well as Benjamin Netanyahu. He asking for exile Hamas leader from Gaza and demilitarized Hamas, which Hamas continuously demanding that they will not leave their gun and they consider it or weapon. They consider it as the red line or as a red line for them. This demanding, what is Benjamin Netanyahu asking for, it seems idealistic, will not be on the ground acceptable. Especially Hamas will not lie down its weapon, and it will not lie down. It will not excite it from Gaza, their leader. So the thing says here there is a several of challenging facing this negotiation, but I guess Hamas has a no power card to play in. Hamas lost all their cards during this war. Hamas just has believing that Israeli community will put a pressure on the Benjamin Netanyahu and his coalition government, but also that seems that it's not it happened because there is a protest in Tel Aviv, but also it doesn't put any kind of pressure of Benjamin Netanyahu. Even international community putting pressure for stop the fire, stop the war again, and going back to the negotiation and for ceasefire. But also it seems Benjamin Netanyahu is not accepting this, especially his part right wing, Ben Gvir and Smotrich, who came for the coalition after the resuming the war on 19th of March.
Yes, Ali, experts, of course, have spoken about this in depth, saying that holding dead hostages is something that is unheard of in many wars and hasn't been seen often before. Hamas doing what they're doing, do you think they actually want a ceasefire?
Hamas is devastated. On the ground, there is no exist for Hamas. Even since Israel resumed the war, their response or their retaliation, it was limited for launching 2 or 3 rockets toward Israel. So Hamas is ready to accept anything just only for sake to stay on the power in Gaza. Their claims that they are ready to leave the power in Gaza, to leave the government ruling Gaza, it's just only such a manipulating the international community and manipulating them to stay for longevity and to be on the power. But on the ground, Hamas, there is no exist for Hamas. It's only just a few military, a few gunmen from Hamas who's existing. And that was a clear, visible during their show, during the handover the captive. Hamas is completely devastated. And also we have witnessed during the resume the war, the day when Israel killed more than 10 Hamas senior leader. So there is no exist for Hamas, in power. And
Ali, we are slowly running out of time. I'm sorry again to cut you off, but I do just want to touch on this final point. We've had again international calls for peace, international calls for negotiations to work towards a ceasefire sooner. For the people, the devastated people living in Gaza, for the families of hostages who are still being held, what do you think needs to be done in order to get a meaningful, lasting ceasefire in Gaza?
I guess Hamas must release the captives and leave the negotiation for PLO as a logistic organization to representing the Palestinian community. Hamas has no experience with negotiating. Hamas is only discussing about the situation in Gaza only, but PLO, Palestinian Liberalization Organization, the peace process, who's perceive the peace process, and we have seen the Oslo's agreement between Palestinian Authority and Palestinian Liberalization Organization, and Israel has been success already, but there is a limitation. But also Hamas is, it has no experience for the peace negotiation. Hamas only negotiate for itself and for its supporter. But on the ground, Palestinians are frustrated while the Palestinians continuous lose their beloved, they lose their home, they lose everything. There is no safe place in Gaza, and there is no hope in Gaza. People are shelterless, homeless. So I guess the international community represent the PLO as a Palestinian representative, and I guess at that moment they will find out some solution for the war in Gaza.
Yes, Ali M. Abushbak, thank you as always for your time and for joining us, providing your insight, the situation, the impasse between Israel, Hamas, and affecting those families in Israel and the civilians living in Gaza will, of course, be covered by us further as ceasefire negotiations continue. But that is all we have time for. We will be here bringing you that and much more from across the world.